Hello there, North House community. This is Caleb, and in lieu of being able to teach in person and spend time with y'all in person, this is the next best thing. So I'm here on a beautiful May day, bugs allowing, with my sourdough starter and half a loaf of sourdough bread. And my goal today is to give you just the basics about keeping a sourdough starter and using a sourdough starter, with the goal of taking away the fear that a lot of people have about sourdough. It's really not complicated. It takes a little bit of work, a little bit of understanding. But you can make really great bread and pancakes and all sorts of other stuff with it. So I think that it's worth spending a little time to learn about. So come along with me as we spend a few minutes talking this over. What sourdough is it's a culture. It's a community of microorganisms, bacteria and wild yeasts that are all living in combination, and when healthy they feed on flour and water and rise. And sourdough starters are something that we as humans have been using for at least 4,000 years, so they're old friends of ours. The ancient Egyptians are the ones that we know of that figured out how to use them. And they've been used all over the world in many different places and in many different ways. People keep starters in many different forms as well. And so here I have my collection of sourdough starters. I don't need 3, but I keep 3 because I use them for different purposes. And they're labeled with the type of flour that's used to make them. So this is a rye. This is a white flour. I use bread flour to feed this. And this is a wheat flour. And part of the reason I keep the whole grains is if I want to make 100% whole grain bread, then the starter I use in it should be the same grain. Whereas if I want 100% white flour, I can use white starter. And also they have different consistencies. This is a much thinner starter. It's more like a batter. That's called 100% hydration. There's more water in it. And this starter is thicker. It's more like a consistency of a thin bread dough. And I'll show you a little bit closer here. You can see how active and alive that is. It's full of bubbles, big bubbles and little bubbles. Those little bubbles in particular are the sign that it's healthy and active. When you first feed it, there's none of those bubbles, and then as it grows, you can see the growth by the carbon dioxide bubbles. And as you can see, I made a mark here where they started when I mixed them this morning. And so you can see the growth. You can see that that's doubled in size. Well, there are many, many reasons for the benefits behind sourdough. I'm going to list 3 for you now. Sourdough bread has a lot more flavor possibilities and nuances than yeasted bread. Yeasted bread can be somewhat bland. There are many ways to make yeasted bread more flavorful, but sourdough sort of inherently has more flavor possibilities. It's a longer rising time, so there's this acidic environment that builds up, and sourdough bread often is more sour, hence the name. But it's not always sour, and depending on how you keep your starters and how you rise your bread, this is all kind of the deep details that we don't have time to go into today. But you can have almost not a sweet bread, but a less sour bread that you produce. But it's just more interesting. There's a lot more complexity there. So that's one of the main reasons that I like making sourdough bread. Also, nutritionally, there's a lot of evidence that it's easier for our bodies to digest. And the longer fermentation time is beneficial to our bodies. The starches break down into simple sugars, which are easier to digest. The phytic acid in the whole grains is broken down, and gluten proteins over time also break down. So people who have gluten sensitivities often have trouble with regular commercial yeasted bread, but then are able to eat sourdough bread. So those are a few of the reasons. A longer shelf life is a third reason. Yeasted breads made at home often, I find, will mold within 5 days to a week. And sourdough breads will last pretty well for 2 weeks or longer for me, which is a benefit unless you finish it within the first couple days, which we often do as well. Okay, the how-to sourdough. I know this is the part that everyone's been waiting for. Me too. We don't have time to go into great depth. My goal here is to just give you 3 of the principles about how sourdough works so that you can understand it a little bit better, begin experimenting on your own at home. I have found it really useful. I've done most of my learning about bread in general and sourdough in particular from books. And here are 2 books that I would recommend. The Sourdough School is very in-depth in sourdough. Bread Alone is a book that's kind of a classic in the bread world, and he does a good description of how to start a starter and then recipes and how to use it, instructions how to use it. And a third book, really the one that I learned from the most, is called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. I don't have that book, but that's a great book too for learning about the basics. I have never killed a starter, and really the only reason that I have had that success is because at least every few weeks I go, oh yeah, my starter, I gotta feed it. So that's the first principle, is a starter needs food to live, just like the rest of us. And you go enough time without feeding your starter, and of course it's gonna die. Feeding a starter is really as simple as 3 things. It's your starter, and flour, and water. That's it. Hey, just popping in to say, I know there's a lot of different ideas and opinions about sourdough starters. There's also a lot of science about starters. It's really an interesting field. They're learning more and more about what is in our starters. And you can get your starter analyzed. You can send it into a lab and get it analyzed. And the yeast and bacteria that are in it come from lots of different places. There's evidence that it comes from different parts of our bodies, from the air, but primarily and importantly, it comes from the wheat berries themselves. So that the yeast bloom that's on fruit is also on wheat berries, and when it gets milled into flour and put into a bag and put into your starter when you feed it with flour, the yeast is going in there. So you don't need to add grape skins or potato water or all the many different cuckoo ideas that people have about starter. Whoops! Starter has 2 ingredients. It's flour and water. That's what's in here. And that's what's in here, flour and water. And the last ingredient is thyme. So the second principle is that the vigor of your starter, and by vigor I mean how much does it rise, how does it look, how does it smell, and the vigor of your starter is an indication of its ability to rise a loaf of bread. So if you have a slow, lethargic starter that's not very healthy, it doesn't look right, it doesn't smell right, then it's not going to do a good job of rising your bread. Unlike commercial yeast, which is always ready to go when you throw it into your bread, the starter has to be prepared and ready to go into your bread if it's going to do a good job of leavening your bread. So, like I mentioned earlier, what I look for is a sign of a vigorous starter is a doubling in volume. And when it's doubling in volume within 5 to 9 hours after feeding it, depending on the temperature of your room, then that's a sign that it's ready to go and will do a good job of leavening your bread. And the third principle that I'm going to talk about is what I mentioned before, is that sourdough takes time. You can't expect it to take the same amount of time as yeasted bread will take, because it's just the wild yeasts are a little slower to act, and so you need to plan more time for rising. And also, just as a general rule in sourdough, it takes preparation time. So you can't just decide the day of, I'm going to make sourdough bread and pull it out of the fridge. You actually have to plan kind of a couple days ahead to pull it out, give it a few feedings, get it vigorous and ready to go, and then you can use it in a recipe. Okay, we're going to do a simple feeding. And the simplest way to describe this is to say that starting, maintaining, and using your starter are the 3 ways I think about it. And they're all variations on the same thing. And this is the thing that we're going to do right now. So we have our ingredients here, 2 ingredients, flour and water. As you can see, I have them pre-weighed out. You can do it by weight or by volume, 50 grams of each. So this is 100% hydration. And I'll begin by taking most of the starter out of the jar. You always need to discard some Otherwise you have exponential growth. And what I'm going to leave is a few tablespoons, just a bit in that container. It doesn't need much starter. And then I'll add my flour and my water. And I will mix it up with a fork or a spatula, whatever works, until it's fully incorporated. There's no dry spots, just like mixing bread dough. And there you have your starter. It's freshly fed. So there it is, easy as that, a fed starter. You want to feed your starter regularly if it's at room temperature. Every 12 hours, 24 hours max, you'll see it start to lose energy. But you can also put it in the fridge and it becomes much lower maintenance. In the fridge it'll last easily 2 weeks, maybe 3, maybe 4, no problem. I've pulled it out of the freezer, out of the fridge frozen in that back corner, and it thawed right out and I was able to feed it and it came back to life. And with your spent starter, I try not to throw it away. You can put it in the compost, you can give it to the chickens, you can feed it and give it to a friend, and thus pass on your starter to the next generation. And you know, you hear stories of starters that are hundreds of years old, and that's how you do that. This starter is about 5 years old now. So those are the basics, ideas behind keeping a sourdough starter. I wish you luck on your journey. I hope to see you someday in the future at North House. All of my North House friends, we're going to make it through, and we'll see you again on the other side. And from Stardust and I, we say, here's to good sourdough bread. Cheers.